If you've been here since the beginning, then you'll know that the controversial stuff is where I really like to dig into things. I'll get right in there, read everything that there is to read, listen to whatever there is, watch whatever there is, and just really go into it, because the controversial stuff is the stuff that I really, really, really like. And it gets the most views. VIP tickets to the British Grand Prix or a Red Bull factory tour like you see these influencers that have only been watching F1 for 6 months and making contact for 3 get to do? Nah, that's not for me. Memeing with Oscar Piastri? Not that either. Peter Brook and I have the same ideas. We want to talk to somebody who was a junior mechanic at, I don't know, Arrows in the early 90s and hear stories of washing sponsor money through the Cayman Islands or calling Interpol on the other teams, saying something like, yeah, there's this team, F1 team called ATS, I think they're smuggling heroin into Luxembourg or something, and doing it for no other reason than it's just banter. Essentially, I like learning and hearing about the stuff that simply just would not wash today. Yeah, we had illegal stuff on this car. Sure, we were doing stuff that we really shouldn't have been doing. And yes, this was highly illegal. Not just by the rules, but actual law that would have seen us locked up if we were caught. But we did it because we had no other choice. It was the only way we could keep up. A dodgy engine deal here, a loan shark there. It's like hearing from people in car dealerships who would be arrested if they did the stuff they did in the 80s today. Yeah, we were taking demonstrated Golf GTIs and running them around Digbeth and racing the Toyota and Honda dealers at 4 in the morning. You know, that sort of thing. And what is also interesting is the reactions to these sorts of videos, because people will come in with their own perspective on things, and anything that says otherwise is immediately slammed. I did Suzuka 89 and 90, and people going Prost bad, Balestri bad, Senna innocent. And when I inevitably redo Brazil 2008, there will be the Glock moved over comments. There will no doubt be comments on this one, somehow bringing my nationality into things. It is what it is. Which is probably why the early to mid 90s stuff is the stuff that I really, really enjoyed doing. It really was a different time. It was, well, 30 years ago, and even the prim and proper corporate teams like Williams and McLaren were probably doing stuff off the books as well to try and gain that competitive edge. And speaking of the mid-1990s, this is probably going to be the last trip to 1994. There's probably enough storytime material on here to give the 1994 Formula 1 season its own separate playlist. Williams getting it wrong, the San Marino Grand Prix, Wendlinger's crash at Monaco, Simtech, the Verstappen fire, Option 13, Silverstone and Schumacher's disqualification, Adelaide. Actually, there's 2 in there that I haven't covered, so actually we might be coming back to 1994 a couple more times in the future. But given everything that happened, you can see why I find it the most interesting season in Formula 1 history. I say that because saying it's my favourite when 2 drivers were killed and several more injured, probably not the right terminology to use. It was a mixture of politics, accusations, legal wrangling, and more twists and turns than an episode of Law & Order SVU. Although Formula 1 would be a lot more interesting if Ice-T was involved. But anyway, after the German Grand Prix, in which more carnage ensued as half the field was wiped out at Turn 1 and Jos Verstappen's car went from 0 to extra crispy in less than 6 seconds, Michael Schumacher had not quite begun his ban that had been dished out following the events of the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. The Michael had been racing under appeal in Germany, a race that saw extra security placed on Damon Hill, as the German fans blamed him for the ban. And they also put extra security on for Gerhard Berger, who took pole. The next race after the German Grand Prix was in Hungary, a race that Schumacher had won ahead of Hill, and since the appeal process was still going on, he could continue racing. I mentioned in my video on the 1994 German Grand Prix that Benetton were playing a game of roulette with this ban, should it actually go through. They could end up serving the ban at circuits where they were likely to do well, and end up losing a lot more points to Williams. So then the circus moves on to Belgium, a track that was likely to suit both the Benetton and the Williams. Remember how it was at Spa in 2017 or 2018 when the Ferrari was rapid in the straight line sectors and then the Mercedes clawed it all back in the middle? Same deal here. The Williams was going to have the upper hand in sectors 1 and 3 due to V10 power, while the Benetton was going to be a little better in the middle. However, there was one small change to this track. In the aftermath of the Ratzenberger and Senna deaths at Imola, Mosley was implementing rash changes to various circuits and the cars in a bid to slow the cars down. At Silverstone, they tightened Copse, Stowe and Vale corners, as well as adding the Abbey chicane on the run towards Bridge. At other circuits, the changes were a little more temporary, let's say. At Barcelona, Montreal and Spa, the FIA had added temporary chicanes in certain spots. At Barcelona, it was just before Nissan Corner, so in that bit of extra track that extends out of what is now Turn 9. At Montreal, it was installed on the back stretch between the hairpin and the Wall of Champion chicane, and at Spa, it was installed in the middle of Eau Rouge. Eau Rouge and Radeon weren't completely flat out in those days. It was a case of how much do you lift as opposed to do you lift, because you still need to maximise your top speed down the Kemmel Straight. There were concerns at this point that the cars might bottom out and a car might go off into a wall at about 180, 190 miles an hour, and they have another serious injury or even a death on their hands. So what they did was they put the chicane in to slow everybody down. Not everybody liked it, but it was there, and they only used it for this season. Now, funnily enough, if you've played Grand Prix 2, the Jeff Crammond racing sim, those chicanes aren't there. Not at Spa, not at Montreal, not at Barcelona, even though the game was released in 1996. It also made sense, given that in Friday qualifying, as was back then, basically they qualified on a Friday and a Saturday, and then the best time from the two sessions was used for setting the grid. In qualifying, it was raining. 1994 cars were notoriously twitchy as teams grappled with the banning of computer aids and also the mid-season regulation changes, with several cars finding their way into gravel traps or tyre walls, although, towards the end of the session, it started to dry out. This is when Gary Anderson at Jordan decided to go for a Hail Mary and put both the Jordans of Rubens Barrichello and Eddie Irvine on slicks. Barrichello went out and got pole. Irvine was fourth. For the Saturday session, it rained even harder. A couple of drivers didn't even bother setting times, but because the times on Saturday were slower for everybody except for Christian Fittipaldi, Barrichello stayed on pole, ahead of Schumacher and Hill, who by now was starting to feel the pressure. Hill's teammate David Coulthard gave what he thought was a piece of friendly advice to Damon, as he was going to be starting directly behind Rubens Barrichello's Jordan. Coulthard had raced Barrichello in the juniors and knew what he might try into turn 1, only for Damon to take the friendly advice as a bit of a wind-up and offered DC out if he said it again. It fizzled out quick enough. In DC's own words, it wasn't so much handbags at dawn because they didn't even have enough time to get the purses out. At the same time, Alesi and Brundle got their handbags out as Alesi thought Brundle had deliberately screwed up his chances of getting a faster lap on the board. Then there was the beginnings of driver roulette, a full video on the topic I've already done before. Philippe Alliot came in to replace Olivier Beretta at La Rousse, and Philippe Adams was drafted in at Lotus, both teams struggling for money and needed whatever they could get. Both of those drivers being Belgian, as it so happens. But it wasn't just Hill under pressure, Schumacher was too, and although his lead in the championship was healthier than a 20-year-old triathlete, on the Tuesday of the week after the race he'd be back in Paris hearing the verdict of Benetton's appeal regarding the British Grand Prix. And if Hill won this race and the two races that Schumacher was supposedly going to be banned for, then Schumacher's lead would be cut to just 1 point heading to the final few rounds, which, assuming he missed Monza and Estoril, would be Jerez, Suzuka and Adelaide. Barrichello managed to keep his lead into turn 1. Schumacher filed in behind and Alesi did his usual scalded cat routine to get into third. Schumacher passed Barrichello into Les Combes and Alesi got by a little bit later on, but only a few laps later, Alesi's engine blew up. Alesi was distraught. His words to the press were, "Everything happens to me," but on lap 12, Berger's car also suffered a failure of the V12 in the back of the Ferrari. Meanwhile, Barrichello was dropping back. He was now 5th while Schumacher led from Hill, and RB's heavy car meant that Verstappen was now crawling over the back of the Jordan. On lap 12, Hill pitted, followed by Coulthard and then the Michael. Schumacher managed to get in and out in the lead while Barrichello moved back up to 2nd with the two Williams cars behind him. Rubens came in for his only stop on lap 19, coming out behind the two Rothmans branded cars, with Hill following DC for multiple laps, which didn't seem like an optimal strategy as Hill needed to chase down after the Michael and DC was effectively in the way. But on the same lap Barrichello pitted, Schumacher spun at Fagnes and lost 6 seconds to Coulthard, but was still able to keep the lead. Hill and Michael then pitted on lap 28, with DC leading a Grand Prix for the first time. While the race was dry, it was still quite slippery offline, so it's thought that Schumacher just made a simple mistake and drifted too far off the line where he just lost the rear end of the car, and then skidded over the curb, recovered, and then carried on along his merry way. When Coulthard came out of the pits, he was still ahead of Damon, with Williams seemingly not telling him to move over. It wasn't until lap 37 that Patrick Head called Coulthard into the pits so they could check the rear wing, and in the laps that followed, he developed a gearbox problem that left his car stuck in 4th. Not being able to use engine braking, he smacked into the rear of Blundell's car on lap 40, but both continued. Damon was a bit confused, telling Motorsport magazine, "My view is that the team should have acted sooner in asking David to let me by, and I let them know my feelings on the radio. They replied yes, and they understood what I was saying, but nothing happened. Once I was past, I was able to run much quicker because I wasn't in dirty air. It's always easier to get the most out of the car when you're not running in another car's turbulence." At this time, there were rumours that Frank was considering dropping Damon and calling back Nigel Mansell full-time for 1995, and this was all part of the reason for doing so. if Frank needed a reason. Meanwhile, up ahead in the final laps, Schumacher was 13 seconds ahead, with Hill trying to close the gap, setting fastest lap as he did so. But Schumacher held on to take the flag and a victory that would allow a cushion if the FIA decided to uphold the bans that were still under appeal. The provisional top 10 was Schumacher, Hill, Hakkinen, Verstappen, Coulthard, Blundell, Morbidelli, Panis, Martini and Alboreto. That evening, it was announced on sports bulletins across Europe that Damon Hill was the winner of the Belgian Grand Prix, and not Michael Schumacher. Schumacher had been disqualified because in the post-race checks the FIA had found his plank, a skid block installed under the cars following the events of Imola, had become illegally worn. The FIA was trying to prevent the cars from running super low to the ground, as, at least in this time frame, bottoming out was considered to be a cause of the Senna crash at Imola. In the post-ground effect years, the teams were doing everything they could to run the cars as low as possible to maintain aerodynamic efficiency from the diffusers, and now the FIA was thinking they'd pushed it a bit too far. The rules are that you're allowed up to 1mm of wear on this plank, but in various portions of Schumacher's plank there had been wear up to 3 times that legally allowed amount. Now, Benetton were kicked out of a race for the second time that year, with Benetton claiming that the wear had been done when Schumacher had gone over the curb at Fagnes, but the FIA wasn't buying this excuse, because when they checked it, they found, as already mentioned, multiple places where the wear had been excessive, and that the wear hadn't been consistent with that kind of incident, if you follow me. The plank runs along the centre line of the car and is 224cm long and 30cm wide. When Charlie Whiting and his crew checked all the cars, as Whiting was technical delegate then and not race director, they found that portions of Schumacher's plank had around 3.6mm taken off. While some damage could have occurred during Schumacher's spin, there was uneven wear in multiple spots along the plank, hence the FIA not buying the "he did it when he spun" spin. Benetton also provided telemetry to show that Schumacher had been running slower after his first pit stop, citing a technical issue which might have caused the excessive wear. Benetton also told the FIA that Verstappen was running exactly the same setup as Schumacher and had the ride height data to prove it, and because there was no issue with Verstappen's car, the reason for Schumacher's disqualification must have been caused by the curbs or an issue with the car. While the FIA did find gouge marks in the plank which were consistent with spinning across a curb, those marks were found towards the rear of the car, while the violations of the plank wear rule were found further forward. So the FIA made a quick phone call and called in detectives Benson and Stabler, well, Unstabler, as I've been binging my way through SVU on Netflix. Basically, they went out and did their own detective work on that particular curb. When they measured it, they found that the curb was far too flat to have caused the damage that Benetton was claiming at the front of the car. They'd also not found any traces of wood, or whatever the plank was made of at this point, anywhere near that particular curb. They went full forensics on this. As the race wrote as they did their podcasts on this particular story, again, not listen to the full thing because I don't want to just parrot what they've said, the wear suggested that Schumacher's front end was running far too low. The FIA also said the signs of wear were longitudinal, that word, which suggests that the wear was done by the car dragging on the ground as opposed to being scraped over a curb. As they did after Silverstone, Benetton appealed the FIA's decision to try and get Schumacher his 10 points back, but the FIA threw it out. In only the third race after the plank had been introduced, it had someone come afoul of the ruling, and this blew up in a huge way because of everything else that had happened in 1994. It was seen as being a bit political. Benetton had not only been done for this plank, but in 2 days' time they'd be in front of the FIA for a decision regarding what happened at Silverstone. They had also, within the last few months, been delaying the FIA and LRDA's visit to their factory and the Cosworth engine plant to answer some questions over the alleged Option 13 stuff, and there were also the investigations into what happened at Hockenheim that caused Verstappen's fireball. If social media existed back then, you'd have had people that make supporting Schumacher their entire personality, accusing the FIA of trying to hand Williams the title because of what happened to Senna at Imola. Well, we do have social media now, 30 years after the fact, and that is something that people do genuinely say. People said that on the video about Schumacher and Silverstone that I did at some point last year. I can't remember when I did it now, but there is actually method to the madness with that theory, but all I'm doing is just telling you what happened. Which is why when it happened to Hamilton last year, it was a lot quieter. The only big deal people made about it is that it was 2 7-time world champions that had been busted for the same rule infringement. As Glenn Freeman noted at the time, Mercedes had not been under anywhere near the amount of scrutiny that Benetton had been in 1994, and you just know that if it had happened to Red Bull, who like Benetton had a dominant driver in a particular season, it would have been a much bigger deal because of what Red Bull had been put through the ringer with regards to flexi wings and cost cap breaches. As it was, 2 days later, Benetton was in front of the FIA's judiciary panel, and the ban for what had happened at Silverstone and the disqualification that came initially from it were upheld. Schumacher would then have to sit out the races at Monza and Estoril, which, along with the disqualification at Spa, meant that Hill overhauled the 30 points of the 31-point gap that Schumacher had. With Schumacher then winning in Jerez and Hill second, and then Hill winning at Suzuka with Michael second, it meant that the championship would be settled at Adelaide. Now, if you know anything about 1994, the controversy was not over yet. So then, a look at Michael Schumacher's contentious disqualification from the 1994 Belgian Grand Prix. If this has taught you something new or clarified some bits and bobs on something you might have heard of but don't know much in the way of details, then do like this video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, whether from the motorsport history books or some looks at the wider world of current motorsport affairs, get subscribed, get that bell on, and get me to 100k because, well, I'm getting closer and I kind of want to get over that finishing line, as it were. But only if you enjoy the content, don't do it because you feel like it. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and pieces that you might need or want to know. Well, there's super thanks and stuff for one and done donations if you so wish. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.